Okay, great. I think we'll just make a start now, and then any others that join, we can hopefully catch up. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and a real warm welcome to this presentation on our Scottish Fiscal Commission Fiscal Sustainability Report. So I'm Graeme Roy, I'm Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I'm joined today by my fellow Commissioner, David Ulf, who will also be joining in the webinar as we go, and two members of our team, Claire Murdoch and Caroline Carney, who are on hand to answer the really difficult technical questions that you may have. The plan for today is to essentially talk you through some of the key insights and headline elements of our recent fiscal sustainability report, and that'll take about 25 minutes, half an hour or so, and then we'll leave sufficient time for questions at the end of that. For the questions, what we're going to do is we're going to use Slido as always. So the Slido code appears on the bottom of the presentation, and we also have a QR code which you can scan in, which hopefully will take you through to the Slido questions that we have for the session today. So please do put forward your questions as we go, and what we'll do is we'll try and get around as many questions as we can during the session. And feel free to add in questions as we're doing the presentation as they come, and then we can come to them at the end of the session. So just to give you a broad overview about what it is that we did in this report. So as part of our work around looking at the Scottish Government's finances, we have started publishing over the last couple of years reports that look at the long-term trajectory of the public spending and public revenues in Scotland, and starting to look at some of the big issues that we think might have an impact on the long-term fiscal sustainability of the Scottish budget. Last year we looked at climate change. A couple of years ago we looked at demographics, and this time we returned to demographics, but we've done a much deeper dive into looking at health and looking at some of the determinants of the public finances from a health perspective. And what we do is quite different from our work that you might normally see us doing when we're doing our work around the budget time, where we're forecasting the specifics of the Scottish Government's public finances for the next 3 to 5 years or so. What we're doing here is very much taking a step back to look at the bigger picture about what the long-term trends that might be impacting on Scotland's public finances, and we look very much over the next few decades. So our work is very much here about projecting what is some of the pressures that are existing here, rather than a specific forecast about what might happen. And crucially within that, what we do is that we essentially assume that policy is not being changed in here. So essentially what we're trying to do is abstract out from the day-to-day debates about public policy choices and take a step back and say, what are the underlying trends in Scotland's public finances? What are the underlying trends in the economy and society, and how might they impact upon the future choices and pressures, not just of the current Scottish Government, but future Scottish Governments over time. And one thing that is really important, and we'll walk through it when we come to some of our results, is that what's quite important in all of this is that given the nature of devolution and given the nature of Scotland's fiscal framework, a lot of the pressures that we see are shared pressures between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So the example we'll look at a lot today around population ageing, that's not unique to Scotland. That is something that is affecting most high-income economies around the world. The UK is no different in that. So some of the challenges that Scotland faces around an ageing population are shared challenges at the UK level. So how the UK government responds to these challenges has a significant impact upon the outlook for the Scottish Government. But what's also important is about where Scottish trends might differ from the rest of the UK, either in potential helpful ways or potentially unhelpful ways. And again, what we'll do is unpick some of the areas where Scotland might be different from the rest of the UK, and we'll look at what that might mean for Scotland's public finances over time. So what I want to do in the short time that I have with you is look at a couple of different elements. So we'll start off by looking at demographics. And then what we'll do is that we'll switch to having a look at the health determinants. And I should just say that these slides will be available on our webpage after the event today, as well as a recording of the discussion here. So let's have a look at demographics first of all, and think about how Scotland's population might change over the next few decades. So for this, we draw on the latest projections, the latest analysis published by the ONS, so we ensure consistency with the rest of the UK. And a couple of things which are important and worth mentioning here is first of all, what's the overall trend for Scotland's population over the next few decades. So the green line here shows you the projection that we were using back in 2023. And the purple line is showing the projection that we now use in this report. And what we see is actually that the projection for Scotland's population is now, rather than it projected to decline over the next few decades, it's projected to slightly increase over the next few decades and then level off over the next 50 years or so. The key reason for that is that the demographic projections are slightly more optimistic on the migration into Scotland relative to where they were in the past. So we're now projecting around about 20,000 on average each year of international migration into Scotland, and that's now more optimistic than it was when the last projections were made, and that largely reflects recent trends in international migration into both Scotland and the UK that have been on the upside relative to projections. I should just say though, and it's quite important when we come along to looking at the comparisons with the rest of the UK, is that the rest of the UK population is actually projected to grow more significantly than was back in 2023, again because of higher levels of international migration. So Scotland's population isn't projected to decline, but it isn't projected to grow in the same significant way that the UK has. So that's the first kind of key thing to think about, is what's happening to Scotland's overall population. But the thing that really matters for our public finances isn't just the totality of our population, it's the relative balance of that population in terms of its age profile. And we'll start to unpick what that means for the public finances in the next couple of slides. But these charts here show you essentially what the projections are for different age brackets within the population. And the left-hand side looks at Scotland, the right-hand side here looks at the UK. And there's a couple of interesting trends which I think are important to bear in mind when we walk through some of the implications for the public finances. So the first element, as you'll see, is that our population, both in Scotland and in the UK overall, is projected to age. And it's actually projected to age quite rapidly over the next few decades. So if you look at the green line here, you see quite a doubling in the population of people who are 85 and over, and also a significant increase in population age 75 to 84. And that's part of a long-term trend. It's related to demographic growth post-Second World War as people are beginning to age. And these effects continue to roll through the society over the next few decades. A combination of demographics, so underlying baseload in our population, combination of improved life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, leading to a growth in the elderly population. But one thing to bear in mind, and this is a key thing we'll keep coming back to, is that if you can see, it's a bit subtle here, and I'll show you a couple of charts that maybe make it slightly easier to see in a second, is you'll see that Scotland's population is projected to age more quickly and earlier than in the UK overall, and that matters for the public finances. It matters because the potential demand on things like healthcare and social care is going to happen earlier. That increase is going to happen slightly earlier in Scotland compared to the UK overall. But also crucially, is that the UK is also going to have an ageing population. So how we respond to the effects of an ageing population isn't just unique to Scotland, it's also going to matter about what happens at the UK level as well. And then one final thing, just to see, you might be able to spot it there, is if you look at what's happening to the projections around our traditional working age population, so 16 to 64, that's becoming a bit more fluid as things like the state pension age increase. But if you look at what the traditional working age population would be, is that still projected to slightly, at least flatline and then slightly decline in Scotland over the next few decades in comparison to a slight increase in the rest of the UK. And again, that matters because it's traditionally these people in those age brackets that are typically working, typically earning, and typically paying for the taxes that then fund the public services. So Scotland's population is projected to age slightly earlier than the UK, and that's one key thing that will matter when we come to look at what happens to Scotland's public finances. So our overall population kind of flatlining, aging earlier. But another interesting thing that's related to that is that our share of the UK population is still projected to decline over the next few decades. And that reflects that first element I was talking about, is that while our population projections are slightly healthier than they were a couple of years ago because of migration, overall Scotland's population isn't going to keep pace with the same growth that is taking place in the UK overall. And you can see that here in terms of the projections for the for Scotland's share of UK population at core different elements. So if you look at, for example, the kind of total population there, Scotland's share of the UK population to fall from just under 8% to just over 7% over the next 50 years or so. So that's another key trend that has an impact for the public finances. So we've got a slightly growing population and then a flatlining population, an aging population, and a population that's aging earlier than the rest of the UK, but an overall decline in our population share of the UK. And this final chart here, just to show you, just to give a final assessment of what's happening to the demographic projections, essentially pulls all that together. And what this chart does is it shows you essentially the share of the UK population by different age brackets. And I've focused particularly here on the people who are above 65. And you see that there is still that overall trend that the share of, over the long term, the share of the UK population by these trends declines over time, largely driven by the fact that it's a shared aging population between Scotland and the UK. What's really interesting, you'll see, is that particularly the next 25 years, Scotland's share of the elderly UK population actually increases. So our share of people aged 85 and over, for example, actually increases over the next 25 years before the UK essentially aging catches up with us and Scotland's share starts to decline. And that's one final thing that really matters for the public finances, because when we're projecting forward over the next few decades, a lot of the time we'll look at what is kind of happening towards the end. But one thing just to ask you to bear in mind and to have a particular look at is look at what happens over the next 25 years. So, you know, the next couple of parliamentary terms, what you'll see is a real effect of an aging population in Scotland happening earlier than the rest of the UK. And that's going to bring its own public finance challenges, because Scotland's essentially going to face a population that looks more elderly than in the rest of the UK. That has implications for tax revenues, it has an implication for the funding that flows in for Scotland, and it's an implication for the spending commitments that the Scottish Government have to make. And again, just to give you a bit of a teaser about why this matters, if you look at, for example, just take one element of that, such as healthcare, you know, typically the average spend on somebody for healthcare when they're in the bracket of, say, 16 to 60 is round about between £2,000 to £4,000 per year. Once you become above, you know, 85 and above, that's increasing to about £14,000 a year. So that's just one element you see of the potential pressure that will come through from that aging population, and also that aging population happening slightly earlier than the UK overall. So what does this mean for our public finances, and what does it mean potentially for the overall outlook for Scotland? So there's a couple of things which I'll show you just a picture which just help to illustrate the effects here. So the first thing is that the ageing of Scotland's population isn't just unique to Scotland. It's a challenge that is also exists at the UK level. That's going to bring fiscal sustainability challenges across the UK for how the UK is going to respond to the fact that it is facing an ageing population. And the OBR, for example, the Office of Budget Responsibility, has essentially said that the UK is not on a fiscally sustainable path because of the ageing of the population. And why does that matter for Scotland? Well, it matters for Scotland because a significant amount, still the majority of the budget that the Scottish Government gets each year, is dependent on the block grant that comes from Westminster. So if the UK Government starts to work on becoming more fiscally sustainable and adjusting its budget in order to essentially cope with the ageing of the population, that is going to have a potential negative impact on the outlook for the Scottish budget, because essentially the UK is going to have to consolidate and find savings, which will then flow through to the Scottish budget in terms of the block grant. And then the second element is where essentially the particular challenges that Scotland faces might look slightly different, might be more significant than in the rest of the UK, because our population is ageing earlier. So even though the UK is adjusting to an ageing population, the challenge might be more significant here in Scotland. So to help illustrate that, what we do is that we pull all of this together in terms of our demographics, and we essentially fold it into Scotland's budget framework. So we project what might happen to the block grant from Westminster. We project what might happen to Scottish tax revenues. We project what might happen to demand for healthcare, for social care, for education, for all the different elements of the Scottish budget. And we essentially calculate, given these changing demographics, given these changing pressures that are coming through in terms of public spending and taxation, we essentially capture or calculate what we call an annual budget gap. And what that annual budget gap is essentially the difference between what we think funding will look like relative to what the spending commitments are going to look like. And what we do is we essentially assume that government commitments on spending, so commitments in terms of supporting people in terms of healthcare support, in terms of social care, remains the same. And all we're doing is essentially just aging the population. And so therefore, commitments on health will go up as the population ages. So we're saying if you want to deliver the same level of healthcare as you're doing at the moment, as the population ages, your commitments on healthcare will increase. We then capture the additional costs that are happening in terms of healthcare pressures, and we essentially fold all of that into what might happen to overall spending for the Scottish Government, and then we compare that with the likely funding elements. And what we do is we calculate this thing called the annual budget gap, which is essentially what the difference between the spending commitments and the funding commitments, and essentially compare whether or not they're going to be balanced or not, or whether there's a negative or positive gap. So as I said, what really matters here is two elements here. Firstly, what is happening across the UK and how might that feed through to the Scottish budget? And then what are the unique effects that might be particularly different in Scotland because of our different demographic profile relative to the rest of the UK? So to kick that off, let's just take the second of these first of all and look at the effects that are happening from purely these kind of separate demographic effects in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. And what we see here is something that just, if you think back to what I was talking about that relative early aging of Scotland's population, is that we're projecting a budget gap, so a difference between spending exceeding funding, of around about just over 1% over the next 50 years. But crucially, that gap is the widest, so it's the most significant over the next 20 to 25 years because of that aging earlier of Scotland's population. So in short, there is going to be a gap between how much money the Scottish Government is going to essentially have to spend and the commitments, assuming they want to continue spending at the same level of support for people on things like health and social care as they do now. There's going to be a gap over time, and that gap is going to be particularly pronounced over the next 25 years. And this is essentially the additional challenge that Scotland faces relative to the rest of the UK. So that's almost like the unique Scottish element, the fact that our population is ageing slightly earlier in the UK. But what about the bigger issue, or what about the fundamental issue, which is that our population is ageing just as it's ageing in the rest of the UK? So what we've done is we've essentially taken a scenario where we look at the population ageing across the UK, and then use the Office for Budget Responsibilities scenario to say, well, okay, well, what would have to happen if the UK was to become essentially fiscally sustainable? So if it was basically able to cope with the ageing of the population and adjust its public finances to be able to respond to this, and what might then be the implications for the Scottish budget of that shared ageing of the population. This bit here captures the additional pressure within Scotland, but the overall ageing of the population across the UK, what's the total effect of that? And that gives you a much bigger budget gap over the next 50 years or so. And on average, we project that budget gap will be about 11% of spending over the next 50 years or so. So much bigger than the unique Scottish effect, but this is essentially the overall effect that will come through the Scottish budget from the demographic pressures that we face. So the green line essentially combines the unique Scottish effects relative to the rest of the UK with a scenario where we project what might happen where the UK government is also adjusting to that shared ageing of the population. And just in terms of the technicalities of that, what we're broadly assuming here is that the UK government essentially tries to get back to fiscal sustainability through a mix of spending and tax cuts, and that feeds through to a cut to the overall Scottish budget. So an exceptionally challenging fiscal long-term outlook for future Scottish governments because of that ageing of the population. The ageing of the population across the UK will force the UK government to consolidate and to act, which will feed through to the Scottish budget through the Barnett formula. But particularly over the next 25 years, there's an additional challenge within Scotland, given the fact our population will be ageing slightly earlier than in the rest of the UK. And to give you a really simple example of why that matters, if you think about how the Barnett formula works, the Barnett formula works based on a per capita share of spending in the rest of the UK, or in most cases in the case of England. But if we've got an ageing population relative to England, all we're going to be doing is getting a per capita share of that additional spending, rather than the fact that we've got a population that is ageing earlier than that. So that's the first part of what I want to really talk to you about, is that overall challenge that we're going to face because of an ageing population, feeding through to higher demand for key elements of public services, health, social care, and the like, and also having a pressure on the amount of funding that the Scottish Government is going to receive. As I said, what we also did in the report was to say, okay, well, how might these numbers change, or how might these numbers be impacted if we start to do a deep dive into one element of where these pressures will come from, and that's from health. So in the final part of the presentation, what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk to you about some of the work we've done on health and why this has a really significant impact upon the long-term fiscal sustainability of Scotland. So we'll look at health, and what I'll do is I'll just run through some of the scenarios we've done around how we think that health might have an impact. Changes in Scotland's health record might have an impact on the public finances over time. And why does health matter? So this is essentially the underlying spending projections that underpin that long-term budget gap outlook I was showing you there. And you see that out of all the elements that are growing over time, health is the largest element of that spending growth. So health spending in Scotland is projected to significantly increase over the next decades. And it's going to increase for a number of different facts. Some of these we can control, some of these we can have an impact upon, some of these that we can't, that are endemic here. So what is going to drive that spending over time? There's probably three key areas that are worth highlighting here. I've spoken quite a bit about the aging of the population. Again, the simple fact that as we all age, then our demand for healthcare, social care, typically increases. But also healthcare spending is going to increase for other reasons as well. As we grow, as we become more wealthier as an economy, clearly demand for healthcare increases. So again, we've got better healthcare than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago because our economy has been growing. So typically as our economy becomes wealthier and society becomes wealthier, demand for healthcare improves. There are also some subtle things that exist within the health system that mean that actually it can become more costly over time. There's effects, something called the Balmo effect, which is essentially saying that if you look at healthcare in comparison to many other sectors of our economy, it's actually very difficult to get labour efficiency savings in healthcare because so much of it is dependent upon caring and individual support for people. So you don't get that same level of productivity improvement that you do elsewhere. And if you look over time, the productivity in the healthcare system hasn't kept up with the wider economy, and that's likely to continue over time, just given the basic nature of how we look and care for people. But we're also seeing changes over time in terms of increased prevalence of long-term health conditions. So we see the challenges around mental well-being, for example. We see work from Public Health Scotland looking at prevalence of diseases, looking at cancer rates, etc. So all of these are adding into pressures on health demand and health budgets. And also quite a lot of the time that some of the technological improvements we do in healthcare don't always lead to immediate cost savings, because actually what happens is that they may be quite expensive. New drugs are quite expensive. They might improve life expectancy, but they actually cost a significant amount of money. So there are underlying challenges within the health system that mean that actually healthcare over time actually can become quite expensive, particularly relative to growth in the wider economy. So we talk about that in our report. We talk about some of the challenges that that's going to bring in. We look at what might happen to these spending pressures over time. There's a third element, which is arguably the bit that where we can actually have the greatest impact over time, that the impact upon how health elements feed through to our public finances. Aging population, can't really do too much about that. We can try and encourage migration to try and soften some of the increase, but that's an endemic feature of our society. The pressures, the structures of the healthcare system mean that a lot of these changes are naturally going to happen over time and become more costly. But one of the things we can do is that we can try and improve the underlying health of the population. And essentially, if we can improve the underlying health of our population, then there's a chance that what we can do is essentially decrease the spending profile that people are likely to have as we age over time. And that's one of the scenarios that we look at into our report. So we essentially look at scenarios where what would happen if we were to improve Scotland's underlying population health. Clearly, that's important from an individual point of view. It's important from a society point of view. But our argument is it actually also really matters for the public finances as well. Because if we can improve people's health, that means we can improve their participation in the labour market, improve productivity. That leads to higher tax revenues. But we can also potentially reduce the demand on spending over time. And again, there is definite scope here for improvements. If you look at life expectancy in Scotland, it has been improving over time, but it lags behind the rest of the UK by the UK average by about 2 years. If you look at healthy life expectancy, actually healthy life expectancy in Scotland has decreased over the last few years, to the point where, again, there's a gap in healthy life expectancy between Scotland and the UK of about 2 years. And of course, if you look at health inequalities, arguably one of the biggest determinants here of health spending, we've got really wide health inequalities. So between the most deprived and the least deprived areas in Scotland, you're talking about differences of life expectancy of about 12 years. You're talking about potentially up to 24 years of difference between different parts of the country in terms of good health or in terms of poor health. So if we can actually improve those health outcomes, that isn't just going to have an impact upon health, the economy and society. Given everything I've spoken about in terms of demand, in terms of healthcare spending, and given what I've said about overall trends in terms of things like funding for tax revenues, it can actually lead to a fiscal payoff over time. So the final thing I just want to walk you through is some scenarios where we started to play around with what would happen if we were to improve Scotland's health outcomes, and what might that fiscal payoff be over time. And what we do in our report is that we essentially play around with that scenario where we look at what might happen to that budget gap. So the kind of unique Scottish effect in terms of the pressures in terms of our annual budget gap, if we were to improve, or actually, there's another scenario, what would happen if our public health outcomes got worse? So this is the scenario I showed you earlier about that relative impact on Scotland's budget gap over time, if we were to essentially just look at what would happen to Scotland's demographics. So this is the scenario I presented earlier, and what I'm going to do is show you what happens if we improve or worsen Scotland's health outcomes. So let's look at a scenario, first of all, where we actually have a poorer health scenario in Scotland. So this would be a situation where we didn't really improve healthy life expectancy. We didn't close the gap with the rest of the UK. In fact, the gap continued to widen. We didn't have an improvement in labour market participation. And you can see that consistently over time, that actually leads to a worse budget gap. So it makes the budget gap even more challenging for the Scottish Government to essentially address, because its spending commitments are going to have to go up, and it's going to have less funding flowing through as a result of weaker participation and weaker productivity growth in the economy. So that's a negative outcome. But what would happen if we were to have a scenario where we were actually able to close the gap with the rest of the UK in terms of life expectancy? What would happen if we were to improve healthy outcomes? What would happen if we were to improve participation in Scotland to match the rest of the UK? So if we were to close the gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and what would happen to Scotland's relative annual budget gap? And you'll see that over time it will improve. And it will essentially help to offset some of that overall pressure that Scotland's going to have because of an aging population. So our key takeaway is that the improving the health of Scotland's population is clearly really important from a public health perspective, from a society perspective, and from an individual perspective. But absolutely fundamentally, what is really, really crucial is, from a public finance point of view, is that actually helps to improve the public finances over time. It will help to offset some of the pressures that the Scottish Government is going to face as a result of an ageing population. It's going to allow more money to be invested in other areas of the public sector. It's going to lead to more revenues that will flow into the Scottish budget. And actually, therefore, investing in health and thinking about all the stuff that we've spoken about prevention, about improving health outcomes, about tackling health inequalities, actually will lead to a fiscal payoff over the long term. And that's very challenging to do. That's clearly going to have difficult implications for budgets in terms of how the government prioritise things. But the more that we can do now to try and turn around and improve Scotland's health record, the bigger the fiscal payoff is going to be over time. So hopefully that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour around everything that we've covered in our report. You can find the slides on our website. If you've got any questions, please, any particular longer-term questions don't ask today, please do email us at that address there. But what I'll do now is I'll hand over to the particular questions that question and answer session we can have today. That's just a reminder of the Slido code. If you can type that in, you'll appear on the Slido page. Please do put in your questions. I said we'll try and get around as many questions as we can, and we'll do our best to answer them as sufficiently as possible. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And David, just while I find all the various questions and start to pull them together. Could you maybe just explain a wee bit more? I think there's always this interest about why healthcare spending rises over time and is quite different to other aspects of our economy in terms of the so-called Balmo effect and how some of the pressures that we're seeing are built into the endemic way that we deliver healthcare. Could you maybe explain a bit more about that? Yeah, you're on mute, David. David, you're on mute. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So first of all, we're not saying that there are no scopes for labour saving in the NHS. If you think of things like, say, keyhole surgery, whereas before people used to be in hospital for days if they had any significant operation, now with keyhole surgery, they can be in and out as a day procedure in a few hours. So there are some scopes for labour saving and progress in the NHS. But there are still limits to that, because if you think of a GP appointment, that's basically one GP talking to one patient. You can't do anything about that. And for lots of other aspects of health work, there will be minimum safe staffing levels that you have to adhere to for those procedures to take place. So the scope for labour saving is just a bit less in the NHS than it is in the wider economy. But why that really matters for costs is that the labour saving in the wider economy is driving up productivity in the wider economy. Over time, that drives up real wages in the wider economy. And the NHS has to match those wage increases in order to attract staff. So it's having to pay the higher wages driven by the higher productivity in the rest of the economy, but it doesn't have the same scope for labour saving changes itself. So that just drives an inexorable cost pressure on the NHS, which is just not present in other parts of the economy. So that's a really major driver.
Great, thanks, David. And maybe if there's a particular question here, I know you do a lot around climate change, and that's an area that you've got a kind of interest there. So there's someone here that talks about a question here about population projections. Do they take into account climate change and the movement, etc.? We can maybe explain a bit about the population projections, but I think more generally, could you maybe say something about some of the thinking we've done about how climate change interacts with public health, or what the additional elements from climate change might be in terms of some of the long-term fiscal sustainability challenges?
Sure. Well, we think of climate change as having a number of effects. One is, as you identified, is there could be impacts through migration, but I'm not quite sure just how far the ONS took that into account in their updated projections for population. Maybe Caroline or Claire can help us in that. But the other drivers could be that we know that climate change will produce much more unstable climates. So you'll get colder, wetter winters, you'll get warmer, drier summers. And some of the more vulnerable people in the population, the elderly, they will be particularly at risk from those types of conditions in the weather. And so you might just see even greater demand from elderly people with complex conditions for healthcare treatment. So that's where climate change could impact on spending on health. But just to be clear, we haven't factored that into our projections that we've done so far, but we think that is a potential link.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, and then what we did last year about just if you isolate climate change and some of the pressures that are coming through in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and the damage effects of that adds an additional fiscal sustainability challenge to all of this. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of really quite intricate potential interactions between public health and climate change that we're only really beginning to scratch the surface of and fully understand, but that could potentially have quite significant impacts here.
It's a key part of the damage aspect of climate change. It's where damage will show up in some of the health conditions.
And I guess the general part I'd say around migration, and in that, and as you can see, what's happened to Scotland's population projections, and the more positive migration assumption or projections now actually stabilise the population. And migration is absolutely crucial, and I'm not downplaying the fact that migration is absolutely crucial to supporting Scotland's economy and population over time, and also particularly in some key areas where sectors are under pressure. But if you look at the history about how much migration we have, given the scale of the ageing in the population, you would need, really major migration into Scotland, a level we've not foreseen, in order to fully counter the effects of the ageing population. So even if we can continue to encourage migration into Scotland, it's not going to be sufficient to fully offset the ageing of the population, but just because the numbers essentially just don't stack up. But it can have a real positive impact in terms of growing the economy and boosting productivity. There's a really good question here. I'll just jump around a wee bit if that's okay. But there's a really interesting question about the lag between preventative action to improve health and feed through to positive impact on the public finances. And this was one we kind of thought quite long and hard about, because so much of what we'd been thinking would be is that it'll be young people who potentially you can focus on prevention, but that might have an impact over 50, 75 years towards the end of the horizon. And one of the pressures we've got is that bubble over the next 25 years. But maybe Claire, could I maybe bring you in on this, because that's something we thought quite a lot about, but we had really good conversations with colleagues in public health and also in the government who walked us and talked us through some of the issues around health, and actually how you could actually get through to positive impacts and health outcomes in the shorter term, which would impact on the public finances.
Thanks, Graeme. So in our scenarios, what we're looking at is it's how over the 50 years you could have improvements or worsening in health. So, for example, we're looking at an improvement in life expectancy, which is part of our modelling. But we're saying, well, what if more of that life expectancy increase is spent in good health, and that increases across the whole 50 years? So we've modelled this as like a kind of gradual improvement in health, a gradual improvement in labour market participation, not sort of a sudden change. And part of the reason for that was because it does take time for these things to come into effect, and that was based on discussions that we had. What we're not doing is modeling a specific intervention. This is about sort of general improvements in health, and we're saying as people age over time, they should be able to do that in a more healthy way if these interventions are made. But we're also not modeling the cost of those interventions. We're assuming that they're met from kind of existing levels of health spending, which may or may not be a slightly challenging assumption, maybe that you actually do need some investment in that to achieve those outcomes. And what we're really doing here is kind of throwing it out to people who are more in the public health space to say, okay, if this is the level of change that we need to see to improve the public finances, how do we achieve that, and how can we do that?
Great, thanks, Claire. And there's a couple of questions from William. Hi, William, just about climate change and what we've done. So hopefully maybe the answer from David there helped address that. So what we did last year, so what we do in our reports is that we tend to, what we try and do is pick up a particular theme and then do a deep dive into that theme and then highlight where there are interactions. So this year we're looking at demographics and health. Last year we looked at climate change. So the work that we've done around looking at what the effects might be to climate impacts in Scotland's society and economy, that was in last year's report, and we talk about some of the effects that come through that. This time we're looking at demographics and health, and in the future we'll be looking at things like poverty or child poverty or health inequalities or something like that. So we isolate it out, but clearly there are interactions that have an impact. But what we do is we try and highlight a particular issue and a theme, and we discuss that. So for the climate impact stuff, that's last year's report, which is available on our website, which does a deep dive into all of that. Great. So There's a question about retirement age, and I'll come back up to some of the other ones. So we do account for changes to the retirement age, the stated retirement age. So we do have that as an impact, which has a positive impact on the economy, which is an impact there. It's clear it's relatively marginal in terms of the overall improvement in terms of the annual budget gaps. We do include it, and it does have a positive impact, but it is relatively marginal in the overall scale of things. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
It shows up in our economic projections because the change in the retirement age changes participation rates at older age groups. So it has a positive effect on that respect, but it's also affecting the UK economy, and therefore it's also affecting UK tax receipts, and those feed through the fiscal framework means that we don't see any particular shift in the annual budget gap in a year when we have a change in the retirement age. But clearly that's one of the UK strategies that could be used to tackle the sort of growing fiscal gap, which we highlighted.
Yeah, great. Excellent. And there's a question here about the Scotland's share of the population impact and Barnett consequentials. So this is one of these questions where you have to lie down in a dark room and just work out how all the different elements of Scotland's fiscal framework come together. So you're right. So there's a number of moving parts. So on the one hand, Scotland's relative changes in population has an impact essentially on the Barnett consequentials, because what we do is we get a population share of that spend. Clearly, the underlying baseline is not impacted by the population change because that's baselined in. So there's a baseline effect alongside that kind of marginal effect of the change. But what also matters is how Scotland's relative tax position is changing, because under the new fiscal framework, that's the bit that essentially interacts with the block grant to determine the overall Scotland's population. Because that's based on a per capita basis, Scotland's kind of protected to an extent, or insulated to an extent, from the full effects of a relative decline in its population share because of the nature of our block grant. But we do capture all of that into our modelling, and that feeds through to what we do. There's a really good question. I thought, given your background, David, you'd love this. There's a question about is education about healthy habits a stronger long-term health strategy than indirect taxation to protect health? And just David used to be the chief economist at HMRC, so you nothing like you like more than a question about indirect taxation. So the question there is, David, what's a more effective policy response, education, or I guess direct incentives to try and, or direct measures to try and skew people's behaviour?
Well, as economists, we normally think that it's the direct tax effects are really powerful instruments. But I think we do need to be thinking a lot more about what specific tax measures do you actually have in mind here to try to change people's habits. We already have things like sugar taxes, and we see them having some kind of impact. So you're thinking of more taxes on alcohol, consumption of other type of unhealthy lifestyles. That has some impact. And the problem is we don't really know just how much education works. That's not something economists spend a lot of time thinking so much about. That's more the area of social psychology. But yes, I mean, there is scope for changing people's perceptions about this. Whether people see that as a connection through to the public finances, I'm quite skeptical about that people think, I better go out and do a bit more exercise in the gym, because that will be good for the Scottish public finances. People are much more, I think, self-motivated to do that for their own health and their children's health. But yes, there's scope for both policies. But as economists, we tend to focus much more on the tax policies.
And maybe if I could, that gets into there's a really interesting question here, which I think is, we know that the full answer to it is around the mental health challenges that we've seen in recent years. So we do account for changes in the uplift in people moving into disability payments, for example, then flowing through our projections. So we do capture that. So we are capturing the effect of the recent rise in people moving into disability payments, largely driven by mental health challenges and inactivity, into our public finance projections. And that's one of the areas, again, where in a good outcome, if we can address some of that, then that will actually lead to a fiscal saving over the time. I mean, the questions about why the UK has been impacted by that is one of the things we've been puzzling about and thinking about for quite a long time, isn't it, David? In the sense that we can see it in the numbers, we can see it in adult disability payments, we can see it in child disability payments, we can see it in terms of where the inflows are coming into, in terms of it being people, reporting mental well-being challenges as being the key driver of the disability rise, and we can see lots of evidence, and there's increasing kind of studies coming out talking about challenges during the pandemic, social media, particularly amongst young people, having effects of mental health well-being challenges earlier on, which are then spilling over into the adult disability payments. But it's still an area where I think we are still grasping to understand what are the upstream effects about what is driving this. We can see the outcome in the big inflows into these payments, but actually understanding what is driving this is a bit which is still very much that we're looking around for evidence on. I don't know, David or Claire or Caroline, you want to maybe add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One is that we have factored in to our report the effects of increase in chronic conditions. So we're projecting that over 50 years, health spending will increase by about 2.7% per annum on average across those 50 years. And of that 2.7%, 0.15% is accounted for by this increase in chronic conditions, of which rising mental health issues is one aspect of that. So it's in there in the number to some extent. But what is also quite important in Scotland is because Scotland changed the way in which disability payments are delivered in Scotland, the way people can claim them, the way reviews of people's payments are conducted through a lighter touch review process. There is a potential for some of these effects as they wash through to have longer term implications, which will then fall solely on the Scottish budget, because this is a consequence of decisions made by the Scottish Government about how it wanted to deliver disability benefits. So there's the general issue about what's happening to health conditions, which affects both Scotland and the UK and kind of washes out in terms of the annual budget gap. But the specific impacts coming through the change in the way in which benefits are delivered, they do impact on the annual budget gap.
Yeah, and there's a couple of really difficult questions that will probably take us to the end, but I think they get to the heart of the issues here, which they're a great question, which is really about thinking, how do we actually get into thinking about moving away from treating ill health to focusing on prevention actions and public health, and how do we what health interventions do we prioritise now in a world of really quite significant pressures on kind of the economic outlook, and again, how aware is the population in all of this stuff about the changes we come through? I mean, I think there's my kind of first general comment is, I think that we add to Isabella's point is that I don't think there's just the population aware. I think we need to make our politicians and decision makers much more aware about the potential long-term effects of the decisions that we take now over the long term. I mean, so we've only started doing these fiscal sustainability reports relatively recently, and pleasantly encouraged by things like the Finance Committee and how well they've engaged. But there's a question about how more broadly across Parliament is it thinking about these big long-term issues in a significant, sustainable way. And that's not just the current Scottish Government. I guess it's anybody who wants to be a future Scottish Government needs to think about these things more generally. And I think, without getting into the specifics of what you might do, I think key from a public finance point of view, and us in the Fiscal Commission, the importance of moving away, or at least thinking about budgets purely in terms of annual spends and making things balance, into actually having long-term plans, medium-term strategies that essentially set out decisions now that are maybe going to be costly now, but we know we can get a return on them over time. And that kind of constant firefighting of 1 year budgets to the next, etc., doesn't allow for that sort of much, I think, more sophisticated conversation that we need to have about public finances. Ultimately, it's politicians will have to be the ones that make that decision, but I think we need to get our processes in terms of budgets and Parliament to actually lift its eyes up from purely looking at a short-term budget process to be something which is genuinely multi-year, and in our case, what we're arguing, multi-decade, in terms of decisions that take place. David, do you want to add to that?
Well, I just want to pick up on the point that Claire made earlier on, that we haven't actually factored in any spending on preventative measures in our report. We've kind of assumed that's met out of current budgets. But if the governments are trying to wrestle with the problems of ageing populations, they're going to have demands on their health spending coming from that, which might be quite hard to then find the savings in order to do the preventive health measures as well. So that might just increase the pressures on other areas of the Scottish budget, like education and other sectors, if you're trying to really struggle with both doing normal healthcare for an ageing population and, above that, try to spend on preventive measures as well.
Yeah, and I guess, and the key point where I guess we make is, if you don't do that, then you might get away, you might put off a difficult decision in the short term. But if you look at what the potential long-term implications of that will be, is that you're going to have to take on average 11% out of your essentially your spending in order to make everything balanced. So it's like a gradual, sustained not being able to meet demand within healthcare, which is then going to have significant implications on education and everything else, and it becomes a really quite significant challenge. Great. I'm conscious that we are about to come up to time, and it's probably a good point to give everyone 2 minutes to. If you're joining us, you're probably bouncing into your next meeting at 11 o'clock. So can I just say before I go, the government are publishing the medium-term financial strategy on the 29th of May. We'll be publishing our latest forecasts and updates for the economy, the devolved taxes, social security. We'll be publishing at the same time. And then we'll be doing a webinar shortly after that, talking about our key findings and our key assessments about what's happening in the economy. So please do look out for that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. As we said, the slides and the recording for this will appear on the Fiscal Commission website. So hopefully you'll be able to look at them in a bit more detail. If you do want any questions or copies of anything or anything around the underlying analysis, please do reach out to the team. We'd be more than happy to help, and hopefully we can pick up the conversation about this in the months to come. And before I go, can I just thank David, Caroline and Claire for joining us, and all the Fiscal Commission team for pulling together this work. And I wish you all a lovely present rest of the day.